Happy New Year to you too. Always glad to be on. And Texas, try to mimic and parrot the language of the federal statute, because the issue here is the supremacy clause, of course. And that says that whenever there's a conflict between state and federal law controls. So what they wanted to do was basically mimic the same language, but actually enforce the law. Now, there's some other legal issues here, but that's why this law may have a chance, I don't think it will, where the Arizona law, Show Me Your Papers, did not.
Okay, that's kind of compare and contrast the two. Tell me a little bit about the Arizona Show Me Your Paper laws. And the thing is that, Neema, this is such a complicated issue that we're dealing with now. I mean, states are feeling the brunt of it, but they're not getting the support from the federal government. If neither of these laws or both are going to be contested by the Biden administration, what can they even really do legally to try to take matters into their own hands?
It's very difficult, and we're talking about state versus federal rights. And whenever there's a conflict, it's very difficult for states to force the federal government to enforce the law. The classic example, of course, is marijuana, for instance. It's a Schedule I controlled drug, but it's not really being enforced by the feds. There's states where it's essentially legalized. There's nothing that state or local law enforcement can do to force the federal government to enforce their laws. Now, obviously, what's making this a lot more complicated is what we call federal preemption. So there are certain times where state and federal laws can coexist in the drug example, but there's areas where the federal government has decided to take over the entire space, and that's called federal preemption. And there's reasons for that. We can't have, for instance, inconsistent laws in Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and California when it comes to immigration law, whether it's asylum, removal, or deportation. So this is an area where historically the courts have said the federal government intends to occupy the entire space. That's why you don't see many state immigration laws that have survived judicial scrutiny.
I still see the big problem that states are going to have to face. Let's go and segue into that lawsuit from the Biden administration. You kind of touched up a little bit here, but it alleges that Texas's efforts, quote, intrude on federal government's exclusive authority to regulate the entry and removal of non-citizens. So is this something where state officials are just going to have to throw their hands up and wait for the federal government to stand up and do something, or what?
Well, unless that laws like SB 4 survive judicial scrutiny, unfortunately, the states don't have a whole lot of options here when it comes to enforcing immigration laws. Now, look, there's still a possibility the federal government has filed a lawsuit in district court and federal court in the Western District of Texas. So regardless of what happens, that case will be automatically appealed to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. And that's been a pretty conservative circuit court, and they've been pretty favorable to conservative causes over the years. And of course, the case may end up all the way in front of the United States Supreme Court again, just like that Arizona law did. Now, years ago, even with a conservative majority, that Arizona law was struck down. But we have a few new justices, of course, appointed by President Trump himself since that time, and they may take a different view on this. But if we're going just by precedent over the more than 200-year history of this country, when it comes to these types of issues, when it's usually states versus the feds usually win.
Okay, Neema, let's talk about what's happening now and what's going to happen next. So the Biden administration just filed that lawsuit today. This effect in Texas, this law is not supposed to take effect until March. So how long before we see a decision on whether Texas can actually implement this or not? And let's say, for example, we don't have that direct decision in March. Is Texas legally going to be able to do this?
Well, Carol, one of the good things about a case like this is really it's a question of law. It's not a question of fact. It's not necessarily something that's going to have to go to a jury. So what the federal government has done is they sued Governor Abbott and the other folks in Texas who would be charged with enforcing the law. And a judge is going to have to make the decision here. So things are going to move pretty quickly. And really, one of two things will happen. The judge may issue a stay or an injunction. Well, the first step would be an injunction that said, well, listen, I'm going to put this law on hold while we hear it. Or the judge may say, well, I'm deciding that federal preemption applies and that this law is unconstitutional for that reason. But they may stay that decision, which means put it on pause while it goes up to the Court of Appeals. That's what we're seeing in some of the constitutional cases involving President Trump and his criminal prosecutions. So you're going to see two different sets of judges make a decision. The district judge or the trial level, that'll happen first. And I fully expect that decision to come down well before March. And then it's going to go up on appeal. I think one of the reasons that this law was passed but put off for a few months is attorneys in the state of Texas, including the attorney general, knew that this was going to be litigated, and they wanted to make sure that there was enough time for it to go through that litigation process before the law was actually enforced.
A live look out of Austin, Texas for all of our viewers, giving you some context. The capital of Texas there, where the governor resides.